Welcome, Walter. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure. I wanted to show you this. You remember this?
I do.
This is the first edition of the Economic Freedom of the World project.
Right.
Walter was a creator, really, of the project. And I'm going to talk to the students about the Economic Freedom of the World project at another lecture. But I wanted to give you your props for that.
Okay, thank you.
So we're going to keep this real casual. We're just going to have a conversation. The title of this course is called Moral Foundations of Capitalism.
Okay.
But before we talk about the moral foundations of capitalism, whatever that means, could you tell us about yourself, your background? And I really want to get an idea of how you got into these free market libertarian ideas.
Well, I was born in Brooklyn of Jewish parentage, which means that every political view that I'd ever heard was either socialism or communism. Left, and that's the way I grew up. And then what happened is I was a senior in college, and Ayn Rand came to Brooklyn College, where I was a student, to lecture, and I came to boo and hiss her because she's evil. She believes in capitalism and free enterprise, and as everyone knows, if you had economic freedom, you'd have babies starving in the street. So I went and I booed and hissed along with every other kid there, and there must have been 3,000 of us. And then at the end of it, they said that there was a luncheon in her honor, and anyone could come, even if you disagree. And I hadn't had enough booing and hissing at her, so I went. And there was this long table, maybe 25 people to a side, and I was relegated to the foot of the table. And Ayn Rand was sitting over here, and Nathaniel Brandon, and Leonard Peikoff, and Greenspan, and her little coterie. And I turned to my neighbor and I said, what's this capitalism crap? It's all nonsense. It's evil. It's, rotten. They said, well, I don't really know, but the people who do are at the other end of the table. So I was a chutzpahnik then, still am sort of, but then really. And I went and I stuck my head between Ayn's and Nathan's, and I said, there's a socialist here who wants to debate someone on socialism and capitalism. And they said, oh yeah, who? And I said, me. And Brandon was very generous, very polite, and he said, look, I'll come to the other end of the table with this room and we can talk, but you have to make two promises. One, you won't allow the conversation to lapse at this one time, but we'll continue it until we get to the bottom of this issue. And two, you'll read two books that I recommend. One was Atlas Shrugged, the other was Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. So we sat and talked, and I wasn't convinced. I went to his house and Ayn Rand's house in the city. And after 4 or 5, 6 sessions, I was converted. I was a libertarian. Hazlitt and Atlas Shrugged just blew me away. And I'd never heard of anything like this. I mean, I went to high school, a good high school. I was a schoolmate with Bernie Sanders, who's now a senator. And, it was very bright kids there. And Brooklyn College was very bright kids then. And I never heard of this stuff. And then I was sort of in the objectivist ambit, but I didn't really like it that much. I mean, I liked the economics, but they had all this other stuff about metaphysics and philosophy and music and God knows what, and it seemed a little cultish. You couldn't ask a tough question. If you did, you'd be booted out. You'd have to say something like, on page 456 you said this, could you elaborate? Well, big deal. Although in my investiture or in my conversion, I asked tough questions, and Brandon and Rand were very nice about it. I think what they do is, for neophytes, they're open. But once you're in the fold, you should know better. You should know everything, and you should agree on everything. So that was my introduction to it. I met Murray Rothbard maybe a year or two later. I kept resisting meeting him because he was an anarchist, and Rand was a limited government libertarian type, but finally I met Murray, and through Murray he's one of the people that your parents tell you not to meet because he'd stay up late, he'd eat fatty foods, he'd drink booze, and he was against the government. So that's sort of a short introduction to how I got into the movement through Murray.
So let's talk about moral foundations of capitalism. I mean, when most people hear morality and capitalism, they don't think of those two words going together. I mean, for most people, if they like capitalism at all, they'll say, well, it's a necessary evil. It puts food on the table. We have to eat. But I'd like to get when you hear the term moral foundations of capitalism, morality and capitalism, what's your reaction to that juxtaposition of words?
Well, the usual view is, it's greed and self-seeking and pure evil. There is something to that. I give it a little bit of cognizance, and that is take pornography, prostitution, gambling, things like that are many people consider immoral. Capitalism, which is the system of anything between consenting adults, allows that. So there is some immorality allowed in capitalism, I have to admit that. But apart from that, which is a very minor part of the free enterprise system, the essence of capitalism is voluntary exchange. You know, if I exchange your wristwatch for my tie, we both agree to it. And that's all capitalism is. If I work for you and wash your car, or you sell me your shoes or something, nothing happens in capitalism that two parties don't agree to. So how can this be immoral? It just boggles the mind to say that it's immoral. It's the essence of morality. Whereas in the case of government, they tell you what to do. They order you. They say, you know, you're going to be drafted, you're going to pay taxes whether you like it or not. Come April 15th, if you decide not to pay, you know, you'll get a nice letter first time, did you forget? But then the second letter will be a little snarkier, and then there'll be guys in blue, and they'll come and get you. So if there's anything that's immoral, it's not capitalism, it's the absence of capitalism, namely government.
So I can tell you're a great teacher. In fact, you were one of my first teachers.
Oh, thank you.
You were one of the first people that influenced me with these ideas.
Thank you.
In 1987, actually. But I'd like to, when you have a student comes into your office, perhaps after class, and maybe he's a little confused, maybe hearing, like you were in New York, hearing those ideas for the first time, you know, what's your lead argument? You know, you probably just gave it, but you know, what do you think is your strongest argument if you want to convince a socialist today? How do you go about that?
Well, I ask them, are you a coercive socialist or a voluntary socialist? See, there are two definitions of socialism. One is communal or common ownership of the means of production. But there's another one, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And I say, with regard to that kind of socialism, are you a voluntary socialist or are you a coercive socialist? Now, voluntary socialists, there are groups that accord or live in accordance with from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. For example, the kibbutz, the commune, the convent, the nunnery,
most families.
The family.
Yeah.
You have a daughter, a wife and a daughter, and when your daughter was young, she was 3 years old, she ate not in accordance with her ability to earn income on the market, but with her need, as determined by your wife probably, if you have a happy marriage. So I would ask the kid, do you want to do this on a voluntary basis, or do you want to cram it down the throats of people who don't want to do it? Which, I mean, cramming down the throats is immoral. It's coercive. It's being a bully. Another argument I use on them, and I say, you know, I have this lust for your shoes. All of a sudden I've decided I must have your shoes. And there are two ways I can get your shoes. One, I can beat you up or pull out my gun and point it at you and say, if you don't give me your shoes, I'm going to plug you. That's immoral. The moral way is I say, look, you know, I'll give you $100, I'll give you $500, I'll give you an A in the course, you know, whatever it is. And if you still say no, then I just can't get your shoes. And that's what capitalism is. Each person keeps their shoes unless they want to give it up for something that they prefer more than their shoes.
Well, let's reverse the question then. You probably listen to a lot of people talking about free markets and capitalism. Is there an argument that you hear people, proponents of free markets and capitalism, is there an argument that you hear them make that just sort of, I just don't like that argument. I wish they'd do, you know, say something else.
With friends like this who needs enemies.
You know,
yeah, well,
politicians even, or other economists.
One of the arguments that I've heard that really bugs the hell out of me is that we should legalize drugs so that the government can tax them and the government will have more money.
Yeah.
Now, it seems, I mean, I'm in favor of legalizing drugs, Lord knows. Not that I favor the use of them. I don't want my kids to use heroin or marijuana. I just don't want them put in jail. I don't want my daughter to be a prostitute, but if she is one, I don't want her to be put in jail for a voluntary act. But it seems to me that the government already has too much money. And we shouldn't be legalizing drugs so they can get more money. We should legalize drugs in spite of that fact. Another argument is the draft. And here my man Milton Friedman, I think, and I go part ways. Now, I'm not in favor of the draft. I'm against the draft. I'm in favor of the voluntary military. But I'm not in favor of the voluntary military because it'll make the U.S. Side in the Vietnam War more efficient, which he favored. And I regard the U.S. war in Vietnam as an imperialist, aggressive war, as I do Iraq, Iran. Well, we're not in Iran yet, but Afghanistan. I mean, the U.S. has, what, 800 military bases in 150 foreign countries, and they call that defense? That's not defense, that's offense. I mean, we used to have a department called the War Department. That was accurate. It was the War Department, or offense department. Look, you have two hands. You could punch me. Suppose I just punched you first because you might punch me. Well,
I'll punch you back.
Well, if I steal a march on you, well, you might punch me back. That's a different issue. The issue is, was I justified in punching you in the first place because you might punch me, because you have hands? Well, of course not. That would be aggression. Well, the U.S. is an aggressive entity, and to favor the voluntary military on the grounds that it'll make it more efficient, because the kids from Harvard and Yale don't go to war, and that's why they finally stopped it, I think. So those are two arguments that the Friends of Liberty promote that I have to grit my teeth with friends like this.
But do you ever use an efficiency argument with I mean, can you give me an efficiency argument? Because, for example, I'll take the war on drugs. When I encounter people who are in favor of drugs being illegal, drug prohibition, most of them think drugs are immoral, and they're not persuaded by my moral argument that two voluntary people should be allowed to engage in trade, and if I grow marijuana in my backyard and dry it and sell it to you, that there's no harm. We both agree. But most opponents, most people who are drug prohibitionists, they're just sort of like, well, I don't care about that. I don't care. So I usually will resort to an efficiency argument. Do you do that too? Or?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, you know, all's fair in love and war, and trying to convert people, you use ethical, deontological arguments, and certainly efficiency arguments about minimum wage and rent control and free trade. I'm not against that. I'm just against efficiency arguments for immoral things, like getting the government more money or pursuing unjust wars more efficiently. I'm against efficiency for bad things. I'm only in favor of efficiency for good things. And let me just take you up on one thing. You mentioned the word harm. I like to put it in terms of rights violations, not harm, because in the market you can harm each other. If you have a bakery and I open a bakery across the street from you, in a sense I'm harming you. I take half your customers, but I have a right to do it. What I don't have is a right to throw a brick through your bakery window. I mean, that would be a rights violation. But harm, you married your wife. She had other suitors, I assume. She's a lovely lady. You harmed them by winning her hand in marriage. And so we are able to harm each other in legitimate ways, not just illegitimate ways.
That's an excellent point. Are you a Yankee fan, maybe? Because Yankee fans harm me. I'd like to ban Yankee hats in a way. They really do harm me. But they have a right to wear them, apparently. So let's talk about Rand a little bit. You know, the motivation for the course and the title of the course, Moral Foundations of Capitalism, really is inspired by Rand, and it's not really the sole focus of the conversations we're going to be having with you and others, but the motivation was certainly Rand, and I didn't really know she was an early influence on you like that.
Oh, a big influence. My first book, Defending the Undefendable, I dedicated to 4 or 5 people who helped me, and she and Nathaniel Brandon were people that I thanked. She was my tutor, her and Brandon. Every freshman class of mine always reads Atlas Shrugged, whether they like it or not. They don't have to read the Galt speech, but they have to read the whole book. I'm a big fan of hers. I think she's done magnificent work. Books, 57, I think, Atlas Shrugged came out, and it's still selling like hotcakes. She's one of the leading conveyor belts to the freedom philosophy. So I'm not 100% agreement with her on everything. I don't agree with myself on everything, but I think she's great. I contribute to the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies, which is a journal devoted to her. I must have 4 or 5 articles there. So I'm a big fan of hers. I promote her works. I think she's great, magnificent. Thank God for, so so to speak, for Ayn Rand.
So, but specifically on this question of altruism, greed versus altruism, and Rand really seems to turn it on its head a little bit and say, the real problem in the world isn't greed or self-interest, to put it a little bit more politely, but it's altruism. It's doing. This is a tough sell for most people, and I struggle with it myself.
Well, I don't agree. See, I mainly agree with her economics and her moral philosophy about capitalism. I'm not a big fan of her on metaphysics or epistemology. I mean, she doesn't like Mozart, and she likes Rachmaninoff, and I invert them. And to me, it's irrelevant. Whereas to her, it was sort of an indication of your basic premises or something. I don't see anything wrong with charity. I'm not a big fan of it. I think that Bill Gates did more to cure poverty than 100 Mother Teresas. But I mean, charity is a voluntary act. She even said that in the Free Society we wouldn't ban charity, so whereas we would ban murder and rape. So altruism isn't as bad as murder and rape, because even her, in her vision of the Free Society, you're not banning charity. Look, you have a young daughter. When she was a little girl, you were altruistic toward her. You loved her, fed her, whatever, out of altruism. I don't see that as the chief problem facing us. I see it more as government or the monetary system or the Chicago School of Economics or well, I don't want to. I suppose, should I mention other people that I see problems with?
Well, I was going to ask, my next question is going to be who your favorite and least favorite intellectuals are. So
okay. Well, my favorites are Murray Rothbard, Ayn Rand, Mises. Those would be my favorite people. I was going to mention Jim Gortney, a buddy of both of ours, and our third co-author on that book. What happened was, I was accused of racism or sexism or something like that because I said that salaries are based on marginal revenue product, which is a very basic element of economics. And I spoke at Loyola Baltimore, or Loyola Maryland, and the economics department there wrote this nasty letter about me, citing the Gortney-Stroop book, saying that even they see what is it? The E variable, in an econometric equation.
The error term. Yeah.
The error term. They said the error term is discrimination. And I wrote to Jim and to Stroop. Stroop didn't even reply. And I said, look, Jim, the error term is an error term. It means misspecification, or you don't have enough variables. You just can't say that any gap that's unexplained by education or this or that is due to discrimination. And what he said was, well, Walter, we agree on too many things for us to fight. Well, that seemed to me very, not very satisfactory. And then I said, well, in the next version of your book, the textbook, will you change this? And he was non-committal about that. So I sort of have a bad feeling about that. Here, my supposed buddies, Gortney and Stroop, who I've known for years, I thought were friends of mine, and the enemy is using their textbook against me, and I call them for help and to write a letter saying, well, we agree with Walter, we renounce our own textbook. Nothing like that happened. Okay. So it was sort of awkward. I mean, the way the left treats you nowadays is if they don't like what you're saying, they call you a racist or a sexist or something like that, and then you have to defend yourself. It's a problem.
Speaking of defending yourself, why don't you defend a few undefendables for me? I mean, your famous book. I mean, this is, if I was putting together a short book of half a dozen texts to introduce someone to libertarianism, this is on the list.
Oh, you're
it's
very
right
kind.
there with Atlas Shrugged.
Oh, wow.
It's a little bit, I'll admit it's less weighty than Atlas Shrugged.
I don't think we should mention them in the same sentence.
But defend a few undefendables for us.
Well, the book Defending the Undefendable is a list of, 25, 30 chapters where people engage in certain activities that are capitalist acts between consenting adults and are reviled for it or are put in jail for it or what have you. For example, the landlord charges rent. I've come for the rent, and you know the way they picture you in the cartoons is you got a top hat and a whip and a money bag, and you're whipping poor tenants, and all it is really is a critique of rent control and a statement that they're providing a service. Yes, maybe it's a low quality service, but by the fact that people are renting, it shows that that was their best option. So instead of allowing rental units, they have public housing, which has been a disaster, and so that's one chapter. Another chapter would be free trade or smuggling. You know, since we're in favor of free trade and the law is against it, well, how about if I smuggle? Am I a bad guy? And I'm saying I'm heroic because I'm violating an immoral law. Just like in Nazi Germany when they had laws against Jews and gypsies and gays, and if I were to save one, I would be illegal, strictly speaking, and yet I would be heroic. So what I'm trying to say is that if you violate an unjust law, you're a good guy. It's only if you violate just laws, such as against murder, rape, and theft, that you're a bad guy.